Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mindset Over Matter. I'm your host, Gabby Gooding, and today I'd like to tackle a very narrow portion of the topic of freedom. Big task, I know. In our last episode, I had explored the concept of choice primarily, and there was a point in which we recognized that there was an interesting relationship between choice and freedom. Specifically, we discussed that it seems like we should see an increase in options or choice as an increase in freedom as well, but that we actually end up experiencing the opposite. We talked about how sometimes we get, more often than not, we get crippled or paralyzed by having too many options in front of us, too many opportunities for choice, and that leads to a negative experience overall. And so today I was hoping to build on the freedom side of that just a little bit more. Now, the fascinating thing about the relationship between choice and freedom is that I'm learning that in order to achieve true maximum freedom, we have to learn to be the ones to give ourselves the least amount of choice in a weird way. By that I mean that we need to be the ones responsible for putting up the guardrails necessary to ensure that we remain on track for achieving our goals. Let me explain. This has to do with the concept of positive freedom. And I just learned about this and I'm super excited to share it with you because I'd never thought about freedom in this way, and I'm hoping that it'll make a difference for you like it did for me as well. So there's a concept of negative freedom and positive freedom. And negative freedom is essentially the freedom from constraints. And so what that means is that negative freedom means we can do whatever we want. We have no constraints, no consequences, let's say, right? It's almost like, I hate to put it this way, but it's kind of like the purge in a sense, in a personal way, and hopefully not in a criminal way. But essentially, it just sort of means that we can do whatever it is that we want, period, right? There's no constraints, anything we want. But that can sometimes be negative in a way, or lead to a negative experience. Because what that means is, if I'm going to live my life in pursuit of negative freedom, that means that I can sleep all day, not work at all, have no income. I can drink all day. I can, just engage in behaviors that may feel good in the moment, but long term don't lead to any sort of objective life of success, I guess. I mean, I don't know if there is objective success. Now that I say that, there's really no such thing. But let's say a subjective version of success. So in the moment, I'm engaging in activities that feel good to me, but long term, it doesn't lead to a life that I actually want for myself. Let's put it that way. So I almost think of hedonism as being a pursuit of negative freedom, if that makes sense. And then positive freedom on the flip side is a freedom to express yourself as you want, or to become what you want to become, or to build the life that you want. And so positive freedom is a pursuit of your maximum potential in a sense, right? You want eventually to have a life of full freedom. And I think a lot of people do want that for themselves. If you ask somebody whether they want financial freedom, for instance, I would probably say 10 out of 10 times they will say yes. But are they prepared to do what it takes to get there? And that's where there's some contention, right? And so negative freedom, do whatever you want. Positive freedom, do the things necessary to have the life you want. And so when you think about it in those terms, discipline becomes necessary to achieve positive freedom, to achieve the life that you want. And this seems counterintuitive, right? But another way to think about it, I guess, would be to say, call it short-term freedom versus long-term freedom, or short-term pleasure versus long-term pleasure, in a way, right? And this is kind of related to what we hear about in terms of delayed gratification. There's been a lot of talk about that, I think, in my circle anyway. And so this concept of having to give up certain things now to achieve what we want later only works when you have a certain amount of discipline. This has to do with career goals, financial goals, a whole bunch of different things, a whole bunch of different aspects of life. If you want to be able to save X amount of dollars per month and you have a limited income, like we all do, then that means that you either get your Starbucks every morning, or you're able to put that, it's pushing probably $10 a day, right, into a savings account or into your retirement savings account or something like that, right? Saving for your kids or whatever it is that your goal is. And so this concept really applies in a lot of different ways. We just often choose to ignore it because it's easier to do so for our short-term gain or short-term gratification. But the idea is ideally to zoom out and think about what it is that you actually want for yourself long-term. So you can think about all this in terms of positive freedom, negative freedom, short-term freedom, long-term freedom, if that makes more sense to you. Or you can think about it in terms of the delayed gratification. I'm sure you've heard one of these terms before. It all kind of relates to the same thing, in my opinion. Because in all cases, you're saying yes to one thing and no to another thing. And I think that's actually a really important way to think about it as well, because the reality is that every single decision that you make is a yes to one thing and a no to another, whether you like it or not, or whether you realize it or not. If you choose short-term pleasure, you're usually saying no to a long-term greater goal that you have for yourself, right? And so I think of positive freedom as a quest for metaphysical freedom in a way, because you're essentially giving up lesser freedoms today for a greater, more important, more personally meaningful freedom to be who you aspire to be and live the type of life that you aspire to live, or to give your kids the type of life that you would like for them, and so on. And so in everyday life for us, this manifests as reminding yourself, why you're doing the things you're doing to achieve an overall more fulfilling end goal. So you'll often hear that it's a good idea to have something like a vision board or an accountability partner. I'm huge on that idea, but something to remind yourself of why you're doing the things that you're doing, right? Keep that end goal in mind, because that'll help you keep that discipline that you need now to be able to achieve what you want later. It's going to take sacrifices. It always does. Like I said, every single time you say yes to one thing, you say no to another. If you say yes to going out on a Friday or Saturday night and spending upwards of, I don't know how many dollars, it can be hundreds of dollars sometimes, right? On drinks and food and Ubers and this and that. You can do that. You're saying yes to that now. But by doing that, you're also saying no to whatever those dollars could have done for you later, right? You could have invested that $200, $300, $500 could have turned into, I don't know, $2,000 or more, right? If you invest it properly over time, depending on how long you have. So it's yes to a night out and no to having retirement money or investing that money into a business that you want to start or something like that, right? There's always a yes or no. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way, because there are times in which saying yes to that kind of thing is perfectly appropriate, right? If you're celebrating something, your birthday or it's, I don't know, whatever the occasion might be, it's okay to have that. But it's just important to recognize that you're saying no to something else, and sometimes that's fine. But then there are other times where we engage in behaviors that say no to the things that we want more, and we don't realize it because we get sucked into these activities and we're not being mindful or intentional about where it is that we're spending our money. I used money as an example because I feel like it's the easiest to relate to, but also our time, right? If you're saying yes to a Netflix experience, you're saying no to perhaps listening to a podcast that you could learn something in, or meeting with friends, or going to a networking event, or something of that sort, right? So you're always saying yes to something. You're always saying no to something. So I hope that that's clear. And so when we think about this in context of our positive freedom, negative freedom, short-term, long-term, we're reminding ourselves constantly that the things that we're doing right now are for a greater goal, right? Especially if we feel like we're sacrificing something. It's this sort of, I guess more colloquially, we would say no pain, no gain, right? The pain is the short-term sacrifice. The gain is the long-term goal. And the important thing to remind ourselves of as well is that it is worth it, because if the end goal was pain, we wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be worth it. But the end goal is not pain. It's typically something better, right? That it's a better position than we're in today. And so it becomes worth it. And so we engage in these activities. And so all in all, I think self-discipline, and I do want to stress that it's self-discipline that's important in this case. I know I mentioned discipline earlier, but then I realized that discipline could be imposed discipline from someone else, and that works when you're a child because you don't really understand life, and so you have your parents to discipline you and guide you in a way, but eventually we have to take on that responsibility and guide ourselves. And so self-discipline is what's important, and I don't think that self-discipline should be thought of as unforgiving or restrictive. Instead, self-discipline should be thought of as a ticket to the life that you want for yourself, right? It's a great thing. It's an opportunity. It's not a restriction, right? It's a commitment to operating within certain constraints, yes, that need to exist to separate you from distractions. Constraints really, in self-discipline, separates you from the life you don't want. It creates distance between you and the life you don't want, right? It separates you from distractions, not possibilities, is another way to think about it. Or it separates you from distractions to open up possibilities or to accelerate your achievement of a goal that you've set for yourself. And so it's important to think about it that way. And there is this sort of dualistic cadence to how the world operates, I think, and how we operate within our own lives, both on the physical material level and then also on the metaphysical level. And so what I mean by that is there are naturally these periods of expansion and periods of contraction. And this happens in the real, not the real world, the natural world is what I meant to say. This happens in our own lived experiences, I think, in our lives, in different periods of our life. Jordan Peterson, wow, speaks about this a lot more eloquently than I am right now, and I find it super fascinating. I'll try to link his podcast episode about this if I can find it. But essentially, there are these periods of expansion and contraction that happen, and I think about them as necessary in a way to be able to find our path. And so an example of a period of expansion would be something like maybe your experience in high school where or earlier, where you're exploring all kinds of career options, right? So you're open to anything, but then eventually you sort of decide what works for you, what doesn't, what aligns with your interests, what's something that's just totally not for you. And then you end up kind of honing in on a relatively clear path, hopefully. And then once you're on that path, then I almost feel like there is also an expansion within that path that says, okay, well, now you're in this field, but what can you do within this field? And then maybe you start with an entry-level position, and then other opportunities open up for you. And again, you're faced with this period in life where you have to be open and be receptive. And it feels different, right? It feels, to me anyway, and please let me know if you agree or disagree, but it feels like there's a time when you're open to possibilities, and then there's a time when you're committed and focused on the possibility that you've chosen. And these two, this duality, or these two extremes, are both necessary for progress, I think, right? If you think about any career, for me, I can only speak to my own experience, and my experience is in banking. It's in the corporate world, career-wise. And so, you have these periods of having career chats, exploring what's out there. And then you have these periods of, okay, now I've started a new role and I need to give it my all. I need to become an expert in whatever it is that I'm doing. I need to hyper focus and block everything else out. And then once a certain period of time has gone by, I would argue maybe a couple of years, right? 18 months to 2 years in my line of work anyway seems to be approximately the time where, okay, I've now mastered my role. I'm getting a little bit comfortable. And now I'm starting to kind of go back into this period of expansion, openness, willingness to explore what's out there, exploration, right? So this happens, I'm using a career as an example, but I think this happens in all different facets of life. And I think that in order to be able to maximize our sense of positive freedom, where we're able to build a life that we truly want, that's truly meaningful for us, we need to be able to accept the fact that there are these waves of expansion and contraction. There are these waves of almost a little bit of negative freedom. Like the period of expansion, to me seems like you're kind of tilting a little bit more towards negative freedom, where you're free from constraint. Again, not saying constraint is a bad thing. Constraints help us get where we want to go once we've decided what it is that we want to do. But then eventually we need to kind of hone in on the positive freedom end of things, where we're going to be a little bit more disciplined and focused and then pursue something, right? So we're sort of, it's exploration and pursuit. There's expansion, contraction. So you sort of see this duality in the process, right? And both parts are important, but I think it's important to bring awareness to the fact that that's what's happening over time. To be able to validate the fact that, hey, we're not always going to feel the same way about what it is that's happening over time. And B, to maybe check in with ourselves and make sure that we make that happen, right? Maybe it's been a while since we've had an exploration phase. Maybe we're getting a little bit too comfortable. And maybe it's time to sort of kickstart a little bit of that so that we can make sure that we're aware of all of our options, and or that we're focusing in enough on what it is that we want to pursue, because I think that both are equally important. So I would argue there is a fine balance between positive and negative freedom that allows for that expansion, which provides a certain freedom to expose ourselves to ideas, experiences, strategies beyond what you've constrained yourself to date, or what you've been constrained to externally. Sometimes, like I said, our parents do that for us. It's a gift, but eventually we need to start doing that for ourselves. And then eventually kind of contracting back or zoning back in on what it is that we choose that's going to be our path for success. Okay? So we need that period of expansion, creativity to expand our thinking, our options, but we need a solid stretch of time that's also going to consist of that disciplined action, right? And so another interesting thing, last point I'll make here is that it does seem like individually we have more of a propensity towards one versus the other. And so I don't know if any of you have tried taking the Big Five personality test, but it does, one of the metrics within that personality test is it tests openness, your level of openness versus conscientiousness. I hope I'm getting that right, but to me it seems like they are on opposite sides of the spectrum. And it's important to be aware of where we are on the spectrum, right? If you're predisposed to be on a certain point along there, great to know. But also important to recognize that it's okay, if not encouraged, to sort of flex a little bit in either direction along the way when we're looking to build a meaningful life, right? So what does this mean for us in our everyday lives? We'll try to recap. So all of this means that we need to admit to ourselves that there will be things that we need to give up in order to achieve the life that we want. And often the hard part is that these are often things that we really like or that we really want in the moment, right? The hard truth is that sometimes this also means giving up certain relationships or certain friendships. They say that you are the product of the closest 5 people that you interact with or something along those lines, right? And that's very much true. You are more likely to engage in behaviors that the people that you spend the most amount of time with engage in. And so sometimes when you're deciding to change the course of your life, it means letting go of some of that. And that's really, really hard. It's not easy to do, sometimes necessary to do. So all in all, important to admit to ourselves that there are things that we're going to need to give up to get the life that we want. It means that we have to understand that when we're saying yes to one thing, we are always, always, always saying no to another. Sometimes that's great. Sometimes that's not what we want to actually be doing when we zoom out and think about where we want our life to be going. And it also means that we need to start with deciding what we truly want, right? We can't do any of this unless we actually know what direction we're going in. And that's step one. So step one is related to looking inward, right? Deciding what we want, why we want the things that we want. And so I talked about this in the last episode. But then the next step is understanding how to get there. And this is going to be different for everybody, right? So once we have a good sense of what we need to do, well, first we need a sense of what we want. Then we need to think about what do we need to do to get there. And once we figure that part out, then we need to figure out in what ways do we need to discipline ourselves and or adjust our environment, including relationships and friendships, habits, our investments of time, money, energy, right? In order to make that happen. So something to think about. If nothing else, I do hope that this helped you think about freedom in a new way like it did for me, because I really think that it's easy to, in the short term, get sucked into a path of aiming for this negative freedom. And I'm not sure that I love that it's called negative, because I think in some cases, especially when you're in survival mode, so to speak, in certain periods of our life, negative freedom or this search for short-term gratification is necessary, is acceptable, is sometimes the only thing that we can do, and that's fine. But that also comes at a cost, right? There's an opportunity cost in a sense to that, because that means that we're giving up greater things that we may want for ourselves. And in the short term, and if we can keep that limited and contained, no problem. It's not to say you're not allowed to enjoy yourself, because you need to live in the here and now as well, right? Carpe diem, right? Seize the day right now as well. You want to live your life to the fullest today and enjoy what you're doing, or rest sometimes, right? Because there's a hustle culture too that can take this a little bit too far the other way. So there's always a balance. But it is important to recognize that that's what you're doing. And admitting to yourself doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's okay. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to take a day off, a week off, 2 weeks off, a month off, sometimes a year off, whatever. If that is necessary for recovery, let's say, or for whatever it is that your short-term needs are, as long as you recognize that, yes, I am giving up some other things that I might want to be doing, that I'd planned for myself. It's necessary for now. I understand that. When the time comes, I'm going to readjust, right? And understanding that, like I said earlier, discipline is really the ticket to the life that you want. And whenever it is that you're ready for that, that's when you get to think about whatever those next steps are for yourself. So I do hope this helped. As always, I thank you so much for listening and or watching this episode. And I will see you next time on another episode of Mindset Over Matter. Thank you very much and take care.